The day after her second husband's funeral, infamous mistress Pamela Harriman made a single call. When the truth got out about the conversation, scandal erupted. Pamela Harriman was a wealthy country girl with big dreams. During a time when women only dreamed of equal opportunity, Pamela used her refined manners and seductive prowess to woo powerful men in high places. Her ambition was tantamount, and by entertaining romances with famous men, she climbed her way to the very top. She was, in every way, both a masterful businesswoman and a bewitching lover. Pamela Harriman, born Pamela Digby, entered the world on March 20th, 1920. Her parents, Edward and Constance, laid their firstborn to rest in an interesting crib, the bottom drawer of a wooden chest. But this simple bedding was but a cozy substitute for a bright nursery that awaited her at Minturn Magna, a large manor and property that promised nothing but a delightful childhood. It was here, on the 1,400 acres of land and countryside, that Pamela had the freedom to hone her talents on horseback and eventually took her riding to the competitive level, performing confidently in shows at the International Olympia. But despite her idyllic and pampered upbringing, Pamela couldn't help but feel trapped by the isolation of her home life. She felt destined for something more. To her, the countryside was mundane and mind-numbingly boring. She dreamed of the city's diversions and the company of fascinating people. She wanted to learn not from the dusty pages of books, but from experience. As an adult, Pamela embellished her educational accomplishments, effectively lying about her qualifications to hide her embarrassment over her meager academics. She called Downham a college and claimed the B she received stood for bachelor, hoping that her peers would believe her to be a college graduate. And then there was the Paris Finishing School. She referred to her time there as postgraduate work at the Sorbonne, but in fact, there was no record of her ever receiving a degree or diploma. According to a friend, with Pamela, it's always hard to find where the truth lies. When Pamela arrived in Paris, she was still a naive and pampered country girl, bright-eyed with a head covered in bouncing red curls. Sheltered by her nannies, she was still more a child than a modern teenager and had difficulty adjusting to the bustle of city life. In addition, she was also completely uneducated when it came to manners of the heart. After Paris, Pamela moved to Munich, but her timing, not so great. At that point, Munich was the beating heart of Nazi Germany. In 1938, the city served as the headquarters for the Nationalist Socialist Party, and there were already outward displays of unrest. But Pamela, unfazed by the presence of infantrymen in her new city, wasn't completely anti-German. In fact, like many others, she hoped to one day meet the Führer in the flesh. Be careful what you wish for. According to Pamela, a mutual friend named Unity Mitford arranged the meeting between her and the German leader. They met one afternoon over tea at Munich's Englischer Garten. But oddly enough, this meeting didn't make as dramatic an impression on Pamela as one would believe. In later interviews, her descriptions of this momentous day were surprisingly vague, and her account of the Führer's character conveniently cliché. Once again, there was evidence to suspect her honesty. Did this meeting even take place? Pamela's interesting anecdote about her meeting no doubt amped up her image later in life when she became more politically active. And while onlookers took her word for it, her inability to name specifics about the dates, times, and happenings can't help but seem curiously suspicious. Even one of her closest friends, Sarah Baring, had her doubts, saying he didn't entertain British girls that way. And so, Pamela's time in Munich remains somewhat of a mystery. If Pamela's parents thought her rebellious phase had already happened, they were dead wrong. It was just starting. She was completely apathetic to her parents' concerns. In this way, she took after her great-great-aunt Jane Digby, a courtesan with a penchant for travel, adventure, and seduction. It turned out Pamela was quite the same. She wanted nothing but her independence and owned her beauty. It wasn't all about flirting for Pamela. Her rash behavior also manifested in her gambling, and somehow, no matter the result, she always managed to get her way. One summer, she lost a whopping 100 pounds at the track, an equivalent of half a year of her allowance. Instead of having to deal with this blow, she ran to her father, demanding he replace the money she lost. Similarly, on a gambling night in Leeds, she suffered a massive loss during a game of poker with the guys, and instead of paying up, she simply cried until they pardoned her debt. One thing was for sure, whether she won or lost, she already knew how to play the cards in her favor. While working at the Foreign Office in London, Pamela met someone with a rather impressive name and family. He was Randolph Churchill, the son of the enigmatic leader Winston Churchill. But Randolph was far from Prince Charming. A cloud of desperation hung around him. He always kept one eye on the ladies and the other on his drink. On the fateful night they met, he was hoping to have dinner with her landlord, Mary Dunn. But when she proved unavailable, he took her suggestion and asked out her guest, Pamela. The rest, as they say, was history. After their second outing, Randolph asked Pamela to marry him, but he was hiding a scandalous secret. What Pamela probably didn't know was that he had already proposed to 8 other women in the weeks prior to meeting her, and that he simply needed to find a wife. Either way, Pamela had more practical notions to consider. More than anything, she wanted to escape the suffocating confines of Minturn and her family, and this marriage glittered promisingly. On all accounts, it seemed to be the answer to all her prayers. And so, she went with her instincts, for better or for worse. Pamela said yes to Randolph. On agreeing to marry him, a whole new world opened up to her. It was one with powerful connections, both social and political. She knew that she didn't love him, but even more enticing than love were the benefits of his station and the places she could go as the wife of a Churchill. They both got what they wanted. As such, 2 complete strangers happily entered into an engagement. When it came to getting his son married off, Winston Churchill had ulterior motives. World War II was brewing, and it was the overarching reason for Churchill's desire for Pamela and Randolph's hasty marriage. With Randolph bound for duty and headed to the front lines, there was the imminent risk of not securing an heir for the Churchill name. Pamela was a beacon of hope. If she bore a son, she'd eliminate these fears. If she failed and Randolph lost his life in battle, their Churchill line would end. And so Churchill had everything to gain by cultivating a close relationship with Pamela. Pamela entered her marriage blindly, but it wasn't long before she uncovered the dark side of the Churchill family. Firstly, there was her husband's excessive drinking and fiery temper. During a fit, Randolph was rash and loud, yelling insults, kicking furniture, and tramping angrily around the house. Publicly, he embarrassed her at dinners. The drinking made him aggressively argumentative, and he'd often storm away and disappear, leaving her alone and humiliated amongst guests. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. Luckily for the Churchills, Pamela became pregnant and gave birth to a boy on October 10th, 1940, another Winston Churchill. But this happy moment had an unexpected side effect. By producing a male heir, she achieved the end goal. Now there was nothing of her marriage left to salvage, and distance between them became a chasm. When Pamela set her eyes on a very attractive American working for Franklin Roosevelt, her loyalty to her husband wavered. But this was only the beginning. Pamela was only 21 when she met the dashing Averell Harriman, Roosevelt's special envoy visiting Britain. Throughout World War II, her husband's constant absence gave her leave to pursue other men, and Harriman proved quite the prize. Firstly, and most impressively, he was a millionaire. Secondly, he was 30 years older than her. There was just one problem. He was a married man. Regardless, for the next 2 years, the two of them carried on a passionate affair. But just because he was a prime candidate, didn't mean he was the only one. Although her affair with Harriman didn't work out, Pamela kept other lovers to satisfy her needs. All of them with generous wallets. She met another millionaire in John Hay Whitney. And then there was also CBS broadcaster Edward Murrow. She desperately wished for Murrow to leave his wife and marry her. Though he promised her he would, he never did. Rejection never seemed to faze Pamela. She simply moved on to the next bachelor in line. And as Pamela quickly learned, keeping rich men in her pocket reaped glorious benefits. By December 1945, World War II was over, and it wasn't the only thing that was ending. It became excruciatingly clear that Pamela's marriage was done. Her lurid affairs and Randolph's gambling were the tipping points of an already doomed union. She filed for divorce, claiming that her husband was guilty of deserting her for 3 years. When she found release from the shackles of this unhappy business, she dove headfirst into what was described as the happiest period of her life. Things were looking up. In 1948, Pamela met Gianni Agnelli, a wealthy man with impeccable taste who happened to be the heir to the Fiat empire. But that wasn't all. He was also a well-known playboy. Like her prior boyfriends, Agnelli spoiled her. He not only put her up in a posh New York apartment, but also provided her with a car and a chauffeur. When her father visited her, Pamela's well-doing surprised and impressed him. But despite her greatest efforts, Pamela couldn't keep Agnelli from straying. He had no intention of settling down anytime soon. And even if he changed his mind, he'd never choose a divorcee. Pamela had no idea of the disappointment that lay ahead of her. In 1952, 4 years into their affair, Pamela made a disturbing discovery. She walked in on Agnelli with another woman, Anne-Marie de Stanville. It was a taste of her own medicine, bitter with a bite of betrayal. she complained and stomped her feet, but none of her admonishments changed his behavior. And then, one night, while driving his new mistress home, Agnelli suffered a violent car crash that severely injured his leg. As luck would have it, there was one special woman eager to pick up the pieces. With all her tenderness, Pamela rushed to Agnelli's side and nursed him through a difficult recovery. But this wasn't the end of their medical surprises. Later on, Pamela made a shocking discovery. She was pregnant. Whether the child was Agnelli's or not was unconfirmed. Pamela had a difficult choice to make. But in the end, she chose not to keep the baby and underwent the procedure to end the pregnancy. This undoubtedly marked the end of the honeymoon phase, as the relationship began fraying around the edges. It was painfully clear that Agnelli was never going to marry her, and for her next conquest, she reverted to old habits. He was a Broadway producer, responsible for some of the greatest musicals of the century, and she was certainly in for a show. Leland Hayward met all of Pamela's usual standards, and gave her access to another alluring world, theater. With bragging rights, including having worked on South Pacific and The Sound of Music, Hayward's power kept Pamela intrigued. She soaked it all in and learned as much as she could about Broadway. Her interest in his life, keen attention span, and undeniable style helped win the producer over. Finally, Pamela's one wish came true. Although he was still married to socialite Slim Hawks, Hayward popped the question to Pamela, promising to divorce his wife. When the papers went through, she became the 5th Mrs. Hayward. For the next 11 years, she played the doting housewife, but as they say, all good things must come to an end. When Hayward passed on in 1971, Pamela became a widow. But now, with his fortune on the line, those hoping to inherit his wealth stood at attention. Hayward's children from his first marriage never really warmed up to their stepmother, and upon his passing, the contents of his will ruffled some feathers. He left half of his holdings to his children, leaving Pamela feeling somewhat cheated. Her unsatisfied attitude towards her share left a sour taste in the mouths of the Hayward children. From then on, they never had a good word to say about her. After Hayward passed, Pamela didn't waste a single second. Only a day after the funeral, and with her tears barely dry, she arranged to meet with the one that got away, 79-year-old Pamela Harriman. He too was a recent widower, and now that they were both free to date again, not that marriage ever held them back in the past, they reconnected and rekindled their long dormant romance. But what was the takeaway for Pamela? How would this relationship benefit her? After all, when it came to Pamela, there was always a profit to be made. By going after Harriman, Pamela earned a disturbing new nickname. People called her the Widow of Opportunity. Only 6 months after she lost her husband, Pamela and Harriman tied the knot. With his fortune, including a railroad company, an estate in Virginia, and a private jet, Pamela Harriman had a lot to gain. But even more enticing than his assets were his connections. Harriman's involvement in the Democratic Party dangled in front of her as a VIP pass into his political circles. With her new American citizenship in one hand and her husband's influence in the other, Pamela Harriman dove headfirst into the world of politics. She helped create a fundraising system for the Democrats, a political action committee named PAMPAC. In 1980, the National Women's Democratic Club dubbed her Woman of the Year. This initial foothold and its resulting recognition was only the beginning of Pamela's illustrious political career. When her husband passed on in 1986, Pamela Harriman took control of his $115 million fortune. But of course, there was a caveat. As with her previous marriage, she ran into a sticky situation with his surviving relatives regarding the inheritance. They accused her of making terrible investments and squandering the fortune. As a result, a civil suit forced her to sell some of her priceless pieces, including a Matisse, a Picasso, and a Renoir. But these speed bumps weren't enough to throw her off track. Pamela had her eyes on the prize. In 1993, Pamela Harriman received a high honor when President Bill Clinton appointed her United States ambassador to France. All those years spent schmoozing and perfecting her social skills truly paid off, because now she could apply them to matters of utmost importance, questions of NATO expansion and international trade. Pamela Harriman spent 4 years serving as an ambassador until her death in 1997. While enjoying a swim at the Paris Ritz, she suffered a fatal cerebral hemorrhage. Both the President of France and the US President recognized her contributions. At her funeral, Bill Clinton spoke highly of her public service. Although throughout her rather scandalous lifetime, not everybody had kind words for Pamela. Over a lifetime, Pamela had transformed from a naive country girl into an experienced woman in politics. She is seen as a woman who was ahead of her time, She took what she wanted and didn't care what people thought, and that she will be remembered for. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, leave a like, consider subscribing, and we'll see you next time.